about two different ECG strips from the final that I want to talk about. Now, the first one, nearly everybody got. There were only about 2 or 3 people that missed it, so I don't consider it a problematic strip in that regard. But this is a strip that nobody should have missed. And I don't even remember who it was, the few people who did. I have no idea who it was. Maybe you don't even remember either. But I want to talk about why nobody should have missed this, and it was a bad mistake if you did. So this is AFib, a rapid AFib, and the 2 or 3 people, again, I don't really remember, who misidentified it as SVT. And that is not a mistake you should be making. So, and that's, again, I'm going to be pretty blunt about this, because to me, if you said it was SVT, that's probably a sign of sloppiness. And at this stage in your career where you're just starting off, you shouldn't be sloppy. It's going to be hard to prevent being sloppy as years goes by, because that's kind of what happens. You have to work hard not to get sort of lax about ECGs, but at this point you really shouldn't be doing it. How do you tell the difference between SVT and AFib if they're both narrow complex and no P waves? What's the big thing?
Regular.
Yeah, so AFib is irregular and SVT is regular. Now, it is possible, both of these are AFib, okay, but they're really fast, and you can sort of see how the faster it gets, the more regular it appears, okay? But what I think probably happened, and that's why I'm making such a big deal about this, I'm guessing that the people who got this wrong kind of glanced at it and went, oh, it's regular, without picking up their calipers and checking it out. And that's why I say, again, I'm not positive, but I think it was probably a sign of sloppiness. I know it is not fashionable for paramedics to carry calipers, but it's something I've never understood. You will see paramedics on scene with something like this, take the strip, fold it over, hold it up to the light to see if it's regular. And that actually works fine, but why anybody thinks that's easier than using calipers, I'm not sure. And your calipers are much more versatile. I always carried calipers when I was a working medic. And again, you have all those pockets, and these things are tiny little things. I didn't use them every day by a long stretch, maybe once a week. But I probably would have used it on this strip. That was one of the things I really would use it for. Oh, is this SVT or is this AFib? My calipers are going to help me. So I've never really understood the reluctance of paramedics to carry calipers. ED physicians carry calipers, cardiologists carry calipers, and they're better than us at ECGs. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but this is not a mistake people should be making. The next one, on the other hand, is the strip that I think was created to keep me humble as a teacher. So this is the one that is it is absolutely 100% definitely 3rd degree AV heart block. It's one that I've tried to explain 2 different times in class. We've seen this one. And most people got it right, by the way, but there's still about 4 or 5 people who identified it as 2nd degree type 1. And I'm almost looking at it as a challenge. How can I explain this so it makes sense? So I'm going to go through it really quick. I do understand why people are thinking 2nd degree type 1. It's because what we know about 2nd degree type 1 is that the PR interval increases. And in fact, if you scan across this, that seems to be happening here. Okay, but let me explain why this is not 2nd degree type 1. I'll let you. Yeah, I can see that would be the case. And I'm not sure how to do them either, so.
I thought that looked easier.
Oh, you were pulling that one too.
Oh,
Okay.
shit, didn't even notice. Sorry.
Okay, so when we talk about 2nd degree type 1 or type 2, it can be useful to identify the groups. It doesn't work all the time, but here's kind of a classic second degree type 1, and we can see the groups, and we talked about this last term. How do we define the group? Each group begins with the first conducted P wave and ends after the non-conducted P wave. Remember with second degree type 1, you have a bunch of conducted ones and then a dropped beat, an orphan P, okay? And the PR intervals increase as we go. So here's our group right there. And two important observations. With second degree type 1, the PR intervals don't necessarily increase across the whole strip unless the whole strip is the group. It increases within the group. And most important is that at the beginning of each group, the PR interval resets. Remember, it gets wider, 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 and then it starts up again and gets small again. And it pretty much goes back to where it was. I don't know if it's 100% exactly the same, but it does go back to a smaller one. So if we look at our problem strip, if this is second degree type 1, which about 5 people in the class said that it was, well, then let's talk about the groups, because we can talk about groups with second degree type 1. So in this particular case, there's a bunch of buried P's. So we're going to start by finding the buried P's. You can see here's all the P waves. And so if we find the groups, if this was truly second degree type 1, we should be able to find groups. So if the group is defined as the first conducted P wave, which is what this appears to be, this is definitely the non-conducted P wave. So here's a group. And then this would have to be the next group, because here's a non-conducted P wave. And this would have to be the next group, and so on. And I hope all of you can now see the problem with why this is impossible for this to be second degree type 1. Because if this is second degree type 1 and these are the groups, the PRI doesn't reset. So it's just a very quirky strip where it appears as though the PR interval is increasing. But it's just one of those quirky third degree AV block where it kind of sets up this funny pattern that we notice within the 6 seconds. So there's no way this one can be second degree type 1. And just to remind ourselves. And who knows, maybe I'll throw this one. Here's a warning. Maybe I'll just throw this one on the midterm just to see. Finally, everybody gets it. But that's me. Okay, enough of all that. Let's start with our introduction to 12 leads. How many people kind of look at 12 leads on scene or have been having fun with it or in the hospital if you work there and so forth? Good, that's great. So kind of like when we started off with ECGs, and I started off a little bit slowly. I'm doing that. This is the introductory lecture where we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts and why we do 12 leads and all that stuff. And then next week we get to the sexy stuff of the STEMIs, okay? So this is just the kind of the underlying stuff. So here's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to do a quick review, very quick, of some things just to make sure we remember from last term, things about intervals and so forth. Talk about why we do 12 leads. We're going to do a quick overview of the leads, just some stuff about 12 leads, QRS morphology, P waves, rhythm interpretation, and then kind of where the money's at for us is ST elevation and depression. Okay, so we're going to start with a very quick review of some stuff from last term. So the lightning review keeps me happy anyway. Okay, Riley, what does, again, this is total review. What does the P wave represent?
Oh gosh.
This is why we're doing it.
Yeah, not atrial contraction, I think.
Except not contraction, remember, this is just electrical. This is just.
Oh, right.
Help him out, what's the word?
Depolarization.
This is exactly why I do the
Yeah.
review, so, okay. Kyle, pick up the handouts in the back. Okay, so atrial depolarization, and then Grace, in lead 2, which we now have to specify, what does a normal P wave look like? What does a sinus P wave look like?
Upright.
Upright, absolutely. Okay. And then Natalie, where does the PR interval begin and end?
Like looking at the strip.
Yep,
At the beginning of the P and then the beginning of the T.
correct, or the QRS.
QRS,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Okay, so PR interval, and then of course the next question is, Andrew, what's the duration of a normal PRI?
3 to 5 small walks.
And what is that in seconds?
12 to 20?
Yes, good. Okay. And Koa, what does the QRS complex represent?
Yeah, it's the ventricles depolarizing.
Yep, that's exactly right. And Chris, what is the duration of a normal QRS complex? This is exactly why we do it.
3 to 5. Small walks.
No, that's the PR interval.
Oh, shit.
Help him out. What is it?
Less than 3.
Less than 3, and what is that in seconds?
1, 2.
Less than 0.12. Good. Okay. And then Kyle, when a wave of depolarization moves toward the ion electrode, the ECG shows positive or negative?
Positive.
Okay, and when it moves away, what does it show?
Negative.
Good. Okay, here's blah, blah, blah. Okay. Okay. Okay, and the Q wave is the first negative or positive deflection before the R. Negative, okay? And Riley, the R wave is the first positive or negative?
Positive.
Yeah, and if there is no, it should just be the first positive deflection, because sometimes there is no Q wave. That's not quite right. And Grace, the S wave, negative or positive? Oh, well, there you go. Okay. And again, just to remind you, this is pure nomenclature, okay? How do we talk about these things? When we have rabbit ears, we always call the first one R and the second one R prime. There's a convention that we don't bother using because it's not useful for us, but if you're wondering what's the difference between this and this, is because this one is smaller than that one, it's a little R. But I don't care about that. And same thing here, okay? But for our purposes, if we have rabbit ears and they're positive rabbit ears, they're R prime. If the deflection does not go below the isoelectric line, then this thing remains nameless. It's just the negative deflection between R and R prime. If it goes below the isoelectric line, it's the S wave. So if I were to say to you, well, what is this QRS made of? You would say RS, R prime, okay? And then this is pretty unusual, but occasionally you will see double, not just double R's, but double S, and then it's S prime. So now what I want you to do, I think the handout kind of got put together in a weird sort of way. So I want you to find the one, it's somewhere near the back there, and it looks like this. It's 2 pages. Let's see, is it the last 2 pages?
Yeah.
So, excuse me, can I hold this
Yeah,
up?
sure.
Yeah, so it's here, and do it on your own or with your neighbor. And what I want you to do is label the forms. If you see a Q wave, label Q wave. You see an R wave, label it. S wave, label it. And then we're just going to go through, just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about. Just from the QRS, you don't have. Okay, so Grace, you're number 1. So again, just the components of the QRS, if you can point to it and label them for us.
I see a R ear and S wave.
Yeah. So there's an R wave and an S wave. Now remember, we always call it regardless of what the components are, we still just call it the QRS complex. Okay? But yeah, R wave and S wave. Okay? Natalie, number 2, please.
Why does it that this is an R wave?
Yep. So this particular QRS, all it is one big R. Okay. Next.
So Q
Mm-hmm.
and R.
Correct. So in this case, there's a Q and an R, but no S. Okay?
How do you know that this next one's not an R prime and that it's a T?
Oh, because it would be helpful if we had more of a strip, and you might be able to see it. Primarily, so let me tell you what you would see if you could see it, and I'll answer it two different ways. This is actually the start of the next P, okay? And remember that even though there's always a T wave, sometimes it's not quite visible, but you can't not have a T wave, okay? And then the other reason is that would make this the J point. And is it possible to have a QRS that wide? Probably not. That's extremely wide. So, okay. Yeah.
Just a real quick question on number 2.
Yeah.
I know I was late, but the definition for an S wave was going past the isoelectric line. With the depression, would that make that an S line? Or
No,
an S?
well, it's hard to say. So, in cases like this, you have to say what would actually happen if the ST depression goes away.
Mhm.
Would it come back up and there just be an R wave? Or, as you're suggesting, is there a buried S wave? And the truth is, we don't know.
Okay.
And so all we can operate on is what we see, and what we see there is not our definition of an S wave. It has to come back up.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, what number are we on? Oh. Oh, I guess 4 is already done. I hit it. So you're going to do 5, but this one is a Q and an R. Okay. Okay. Number 5.
R.
Yes, that's right. So just an R wave there. Okay, 6.
Let's see, so, Q, R, that's it.
Actually, that's not, I understand why you're saying that, but that's not quite right. So this is one of those, by the way, what is this? What's this rhythm? Excuse me? Say it louder. Idioventricular. And this is a very common pattern that you're going to see with ventricular rhythms, where the QRS is either entirely or mostly negative, or else entirely or mostly positive, and the T wave goes in the opposite direction. So remember what I just said to Natalie, there has to be a T wave. Now, sometimes you can't see the T wave in certain leads, but in this particular case, this is the T, and the Q, the J point is probably about here. There's ST elevation. And when all you have is a big negative deflection and no positive deflections, you have a choice of what to call it. I mean, it's still the QRS complex, but as far as the specific waveform, you can either call this the Q wave, and I'm totally happy with that. Sometimes you'll see people call it a QS wave, because we don't really know, right? All there is a negative deflection. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so this is not, an R wave, that's a T wave.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, like I say, this is one of these patterns you're going to see again and again and again and again. So that's, so pretty soon you'll say, oh yeah, T wave, obviously. So, okay, number 8, please. Oh, sorry, number 7. Number 7.
An R, S, and R prime.
Okay, so point to the R.
The first R is right there,
Uh-huh.
a little up there.
Okay.
The S.
Okay, so I'm going to sort of talk about it in the same way that I talked about Chris's, this is another, this is probably idioventricular rhythm as well. I'm only giving you one, one beat, but there has to be a T wave. And so this is actually very, very similar to this. The only difference is there's a little tiny bit of an R wave. And again, a really good thing for all of you to remember is that with all ventricular rhythms, idioventricular accelerated in VTAC, it doesn't have to be, but it's common to see either one big negative deflection or almost, like in this case, it's not totally one, but it's almost one, or one big positive. If it's a negative deflection, the T wave will be in the opposite direction, so positive. If the QRS is one big positive direction, the T wave will be inverted. In other words, it'll take this and flip it over. That's another very common ventricular pattern. Okay? So questions? Okay, this is exactly why I do this. Number 8, please.
So is that significant enough to be an R?
I don't know.
Okay.
What's the, let's say no, what would that make
Then
it?
it would be, then this would be a Q.
Yeah, that is an unknown. I mean, it truly is an unknown. You have very sharp eyes to see it. In this particular case, I said it wasn't there. But it is really, that is kind of a problem that you're gonna bump into, is that little nubbin. Because if it's an R wave, then what does it make it?
Then that would be an S.
That's correct.
instead.
But in this case, I said, nah, so, but if you said, no, I'm sure it's there, I'd say, oh, well, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, number 9.
So are we counting this nubbin?
Yeah, now that, in that
Yeah.
case, that is a true nubbin. That is a true R wave. There's no question there. Okay, that's not in doubt.
So R, S.
Correct, absolutely correct. And by the way, that always becomes problematic in the early V leads. That's where you sit there and go, you're right. Okay, number 10, please.
Okay, we have the Q,
Mm-hmm,
and we have an R.
correct. Okay, number 11.
This is an R, an S, and I thought this was R prime, but now I'm gonna say T, so we don't see a T wave.
You know, this one isn't fair because I didn't give you what happens afterwards. I understand why you're doing it. You're following what I said a minute ago. Yeah, so my apologies. The T wave is over here, and that would make it. So that's my fault for not including the whole thing. Also, while it's not impossible, that's an incredibly sharp T.
Yeah.
Okay,
that makes sense.
yeah. Okay, 12, please.
R and R prime.
Excellent. Okay, R prime. Okay, 13.
R and R prime.
Yep. 14.
So is that that QS wave?
Well, it's not a QS wave because this is part, again, this, it would have been easier for you had I included the T. You can see it going up like that. Okay, so if this, so what would that make this?
That's the Q wave.
And then what's that?
R wave.
Yeah, it's an R wave. And again, you're just not going to see sharp T's like that. So I understand, why the confusion is there. But like I should have just included the T wave. 15, please.
RS,
Yes. And then 16.
16, so R, and then S, and then S prime.
Perfect. Okay, little tiny S prime there. Okay, questions about that one? Okay. Oh, well, 17's given to you, so that's just a Q or a QS, so let's do 18.
I mean, there's an R, an S,
Mhm.
and a T. I mean, technically.
Yeah, so again, we're just looking at the QRS, so you're correct. There is a T wave there, but that is an R and that's an S.
What's going on with the little like stalactite up there on the top? What's going on?
Oh.
The other lead above it.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's,
okay.
what's happening in, these are really enormous, you see how I cut it off?
Okay, yeah.
And so that's it hanging down, the stalactite there.
I know, I gotta throw it at you.
It's okay. I don't know if I'll catch it. This is R, and then is that R prime?
Yep, it is. Okay, so if this was awkward for you, work on it, because this term we are going to be talking about the components of the QRS. And if I started adding this little exercise because I realized that, of course, we don't talk about this stuff that much in fall term, and of course people didn't remember, and I'd be talking about something, and I'd say, oh, the Q wave or R prime, and I realized nobody had any idea what I was talking about. So that's why I added that in. So if it's awkward for you, go back and redo it another time. Okay. Kyle, why do paramedics use 12 leads?
Try and find an infarction.
Okay, that's absolutely the main reason. What else? Why else do we use 12 leads? Or what else can we use 12 leads for? Put it that way.
Hyper K.
Oh, good answer. Yeah, it's much easier to see hyper K on a 12 lead than on something else. What else?
Bundle branch blocks.
Bundle branch blocks. Okay. So I have 3 reasons here, but I really like Natalie's. I might add it in by the afternoon. Hyper K, and also things like TCA overdose. Much easier to see with a 12 lead. But does anybody have any idea how much the monitors that you all?
Like 60,000.
Yeah, they're incredibly expensive. So it's crazy how much. They're like, it depends on a multitude of things, but they're very expensive. And believe me, they don't give us, a $40,000 machine so we can tell bundle branch blocks. So the main reason where the money's at is to detect ST elevation MIs. But it's an incredibly powerful tool, and the more the more you learn to use it, the more things you can use it for, and the more helpful it will be. So, for example, once this term will kind of sort of wrap up our investigation into how to identify STEMIs on a 12 lead. And a lot of the stuff we're going to be doing after that is to look for other signs of ischemia, more subtle signs. And those also can be very useful when, with a 12 lead. And then occasionally having a 12 lead will actually, even though typically we do the rhythm interpretation from lead 2, occasionally having that 12 lead really helps us figure out what's really happening there. Okay, so how good is a 12 lead at detecting MIs? That's why we have it. How good is it? Anybody know? Like suppose you put the leads on your patient. They're experiencing some kinds of acute coronary syndrome, some kind of symptoms of that, and you, to the best of your ability, you're looking at it and you're saying, STEMI.
Depends if
Yes,
it's a
no?
full STEMI and where it is. Too.
Say that again?
Depends if it's a full STEMI or an end STEMI and where it is, right?
Let's not worry about end STEMIs for a while. Let's just say STEMI. Suppose you see a sign of a STEMI. Is a pretty good indication that person's having a MI? Should you turn to them and say, this, I think, yeah. So actually, if the 12 lead shows good evidence of a STEMI, and we're assuming the person who's looking at it knows what they're doing, okay? But if it's good evidence and it's being properly read, then the chances are really high, like up in the 90s, that that patient is actually experiencing an acute MI. So it's very good. There are not very many, again, as long as you know what you're doing, there aren't a lot of false positives if you're reading it correctly, okay? However, excuse me, if the 12 lead shows no evidence of a STEMI, do you turn to your patient and say, you're free to go. You don't have to go to the hospital at all, okay? So no. So 12 leads are very good. There are very few false positives, but there are a larger percentage of false negatives, meaning that if you see, even if you see no signs, from 1 to 10% of patients who are experiencing acute MI have a completely normal ECG. You know, not just no, specific signs of a STEMI, but no signs of ischemia at all. You know, if you were to read the 12 lead without seeing the patient, you think, oh, that's no problem with this person. So keep that in mind, is it's very good at, if you're reading it properly, at ruling in a STEMI, but it's not good at ruling out a STEMI. Yeah, Riley.
How does, I mean, I know it's not necessarily relevant, but how does the ER, for example, detect, MI that isn't ECG or EKG?
Excuse me? Oh, so how do they do it? What Kyle was saying?
Blood work?
Yeah, blood work.
Okay.
Okay. Well, what happens if there's good evidence of a STEMI? Do they wait for the blood work to take somebody to the cath lab? No, they just go, straight to the cath lab. Yes.
I know some, if not all, monitors will read STEMI alert or those abnormal findings for 40+ female. How good are the monitors at reading themselves?
So that's a great question. The monitor is really, there are some things that you can really mostly hang your hat on, like usually when you see, and in a little bit will be seen, when you see the printout on the right-hand side, if you're holding it like this, on the right-hand side is the interpretation, on the left-hand side are the stats. Yeah, the numbers mostly are very good. The interpretation frequently are very good, but not always. And certainly we're going to be seeing in the next, throughout this whole 12 lead, both winter and spring, we'll look at plenty where if you depend on the readout, you're screwed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a good rule of thumb is that do your own, it's really hard when you see acute STEMI suspected. It's hard to ignore that. But I think it's a very good rule of thumb to do your own interpretation and then look at the readout. And if you're in agreement, you're great. If you're not in agreement, try to figure it out, okay? And I would never ignore acute MI suspected, even if I'm not seeing it. But on the other hand, you could be right and it could be wrong, okay? So the other thing is that typically, a lot of times, the printout makes the same mistake that people make. You know what I mean? So things that might fool you are also going to fool it. So, okay. So, is there, I think 12 leads are great. I think I worked in the field before we had 12 leads, and I worked in the field after we had 12 leads, and we gave much better care when we had 12 leads, and it was much more fun and interesting when we did have 12 leads. So I am all for 12 leads. But is there a pitfall? Is there something that can trip you up? I mean, there's plenty of things that can trip you up, but is there something in particular? What do you think? Is it always a good idea? What do you think?
I mean, it takes a while to put on.
Say it again?
It takes a while to put on. It can.
I don't know. I used to work with every time I had a partner any length of time, our rule of thumb was we wanted those, if we thought it was going to be a possible STEMI, we wanted those leads on within the first 5 minutes, and we typically did. If if you say, I'm gonna get them on, you can get them on,
Unless they're super sweaty.
I was gonna say that's true. I was also shake all those moves that you have to each other. Okay, but most of the time you can get them on pretty quick. What else? Yes?
I know with like 12 leads in a more like less emergent situation, they're always like if you have a belt on or like jewelry on, or it like causes a lot of artifacts. So like when you're doing it really quickly, it's gonna.
That's true. That's true. 12 leads are a little more sensitive than just the 4 leads, so you can pick up artifact. What about, you all are not paramedics yet, but you're EMTs. So there you are, you've got a paramedic partner, and you know, either you are fire or whatever. There's more paramedics. There's 4 paramedics on scene, and you're the sole EMT. And you know, they do a 12 lead. What happens to those 4 paramedics? What do they start doing?
They carry their patients.
Yeah, exactly. They go off in the corner and they start arguing about the 12 lead, and you're sitting there with the patient going, no breathing, no pulse, you know, and they're like, oh. So, you know, I don't think this is a big pitfall, but certainly we see it. You know, the more technology we have, and I'm all for technology, is that sometimes we forget about the patient. So this, to me, is a great example. What is wrong with this picture? What is this, first of all?
Mess. I don't like it.
Well, I don't like it either. What is it? It's VFib. What's wrong? What are they doing? Why aren't they doing CPR? Somebody didn't notice this patient went into, I have no idea where this came from. I mean, I found it at some point. I went, why aren't they doing CPR? Why aren't they shocking? They're sitting there doing 12 leads. But anyway, but generally speaking, of course, they're great. And one thing I will say about 12 leads is I am certain that when you had your interview to get into this school, that you were asked, now why do you want to be a paramedic? And I'm certain that somewhere in all of your answers, and I'm sure it was sincere, is I want to help people and I want to make a difference in people's lives. It's not the only reason we become paramedics, but it's a big one, I think, for all of us. And I have to say, if you get good at 12 leads, if you really work on that skill, it is a way that you can make a huge difference in somebody's life. And you know, you can save lives and make a big difference in their quality of life if you act properly and see things. So anyway, that's the little commercial. Okay. So we know that a lead is a view of the heart. So why do we need 12 leads? Why can't we just rely on good old lead 2? And, I don't know, maybe add in a few others.
Different parts of the heart from different angles.
Yeah. So if one part of the heart is infarcting, unless we're looking at it, we may be missing it, okay? So when a portion of the heart becomes ischemic or infarcted, it shows up in various ways. And we need many views of the heart in order to detect these signs of affected areas. So here is how a regular 12 lead is laid out. Now, are all 12 leads laid out like this? No. If you look at, say, European 12 leads, they're a little bit different, okay? But this is the most typical in the US, the most typical that you will see, where it's very specific. You can see that there. Here is a picture of a hospital 12 lead. Again, the top part here is the actual 12 lead. So we have lead 1, lead 2, lead 3, AVR, AVL, AVF, V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6. That's the actual 12 lead. And then the hospital, because they don't have to carry, they have a nice little cart to wheel things around. They can have a great big machine, and they can use really big paper. And so they usually will have the option to run out essentially rhythm strips along the bottom. And they can choose which one. In this particular case, they've chosen V1, 2, or V5, and they can switch that around. As opposed to a pre-hospital, where we have to carry them, so we tend to have smaller machines and smaller paper, and we just have the 12 lead itself. As you will probably all know, usually what we'll do is we'll run off a lead 2 strip before we do the 12 lead to look at our rhythm interpretation. Okay. So again, note that the top 3 lines of the hospital 12 lead match the 3 lines on the pre-hospital. Again, they use larger paper. So, what I want you to do now is, I'm going to hide this, cleverly hide this. And then when you're done, you can just check yourself against it, okay? So this, if it's not super obvious, super easy, second nature for you to know where these leads are, make sure by next week they are, okay? So that's really important. Okay.
Do you have to have V1, V2, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the proper way to?
Oh, okay. So, let me point out a couple things. In a minute, we're going to go through all the leads, but I'll kind of answer part of your question here. Leads 1, 2, and 3. First of all, these are by convention, and you need to follow it. They're always Roman numerals, okay? So sometimes people will use like Arabic numbers here, 1, 2, 3. That's not proper because otherwise you get mixed up with the V leads. The V leads have 3 different names. The official name and it's all the same thing. The official name are the precordials. Sometimes you'll hear people call them chest leads, and most people, I think, because we're all lazy, call them V leads. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so how do we decide which areas of the heart that we want to look at? I mean, 12 sounds like a lot, but there's big portions of the heart that we're not looking at with a 12 lead. So, Chris, which portion of the heart most frequently is infarcted? Which part of the heart is probably, based on, if you think about, is working the hardest?
The left ventricle.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And for that reason, that's the part that most infarcts are on the left side of the heart. So when we're talking about, say, the anterior leads, what we're talking about is the anterior of the left ventricle. So for the most part, those 12 leads are set up to look at the left ventricle. So, in fact, all of the leads on a 12 lead are set up in order to view areas of the left ventricle most likely to suffer an infarct. And what you're going to need to learn are what are the names of these areas. Okay, so we're going to talk about the inferior region, the anterior, the septal, and the lateral. So for example, when we say the lateral, meaning side, what we really mean is the side of the left ventricle. When we talk about the anterior region, which means front, we're talking about the front of the left ventricle. Inferior, we're talking about the bottom of the left ventricle. Now, are these the only areas of the heart that can become infarcted? And where else can become infarcted that you know about?
The right side, you have to move.
Uh-huh, the right side? Yeah, and so later on, at the end of next week actually, we're going to talk about right-sided MIs and also posterior MIs. Because the way we have the leads set up with a 12 lead, we're looking at the front of the left ventricle, the bottom of the left ventricle, and the side of the left ventricle. With a 12 lead, there's nothing looking at the back of the heart, which occasionally does become infarcted. So again, we'll talk about that next week, how we set that up. So we're going to start by, and this is kind of, we did this last fall, but we're going to review about how these leads are set up, how the electrodes are used to create the leads. So from the right arm, and left leg, we can create the 6 limb leads, okay? And there are 3 bipolar limb leads, and this should be, we talked about this last fall, this is just a review. Leads 1, leads 2, and leads 3 are considered the bipolar limb leads. And then AVR, AVL, and AVF are considered the unipolar limb leads. Okay? Now remember the bipolar limb leads use two of the electrodes to create their leads. So for example, with lead 2, which are the two electrodes used to create the view of lead 2?
Left leg,
Uh-huh.
arm.
Yeah, left leg, right arm, okay? And then lead 1, remember, it's going to be left arm, left leg, and, left arm, right arm. And lead 3, left arm, left leg. The unipolar limb leads takes the information, the data gathered from those 3 original electrodes, takes that information, and it creates a constructed electrode, which is in the center of the heart, okay? And in the unipolar limb lead, this imaginary electrode is the negative eye of the electrode, and the positive eyes are the electrodes looking in. Okay, remember this? Remember this from last fall? So the limb leads, 1, 2, 3, AVR, AVL, AVF, are all in this vertical plane. And this is the direction that they're looking. These are the positive eyes of all the limb leads. So we've talked a lot about lead 2, that the positive eye is on the left leg, okay? So here's the positive, here's how the limb leads lay out, okay? So which 3, we're going to get to it in a minute, but just looking at this, there are 3 leads here, 3 limb leads that are set up to look at the bottom of the heart. So Riley, knowing that all of these are the positive eyes looking in at the heart, based on what you see here, which of the 3 leads that are set up to look at the bottom of the heart?
2, 3, and AVF.
Bingo, those are the inferior leads, okay? So that's the logic behind it, okay? We're going to go through all that in a minute. Then the V leads all come from the electrodes that we set up secondarily, okay? The ones that go across, they come across the chest to the side. And they, again, we have an imaginary negative pole in the center of the heart created by the data gathering. And all of these leads are looking straight in toward the center of the heart, okay? Okay, so there's the precordials. And again, we can say precordials, we can say chest leads or V leads, all the same thing. Okay, so just to remind ourselves, the limb leads are on, looking at the 12 leads, are on the left side of the 12 lead. The limb leads are 1, 2, and 3, are the bipolar limb leads. AVR, AVL, and AVF are the unipolar limb leads. So here's all the limb leads. And then the V leads, V1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the precordials. Yes?
I'm sorry,
That's fair.
the polarity of the limb leads, I don't understand like the relevancy of that, like why are we
Do you
discussing
remember, so if we talk about the limb leads, we have right arm, there's 3 electrodes, right?
Mhm.
Left arm, and then left leg. And remember that 4th one is simply a ground, is irrelevant, okay? These are the electrodes that we get all the information for the limb leads,
Mhm.
okay? Remember that what we say is that the positive end of the electrode is like the eye of the electrode.
Okay, yeah.
So if you know where the positive end is, you know which direction it's looking. So for example, all last fall, we kept saying, oh, lead 2, which goes like this, from right arm to left leg, this is the positive eye, so it's looking up at the bottom of the heart.
Okay.
So for lead 2, negative is here and positive is here.
Gotcha.
Okay, and then for lead, so for lead 3, the positive is here and the negative is here. okay? And then for lead 1, it's like this, okay? So that's the significance.
And then
So-
unipolar, so like
Yeah.
unipolar, what does that indicate?
So,
Those are bipolar, correct? Ones we just-
yeah, those are the bipolar ones. The unipolar are kind of a misnomer in the way of saying, is it really a one-pole electrode or one-pole lead?
Mhm.
It is and it isn't. What we do is that we take, so here's AVF, AVR, and AVL. Okay, and here's our heart. We take the information from those electrodes and we create an imaginary negative pole.
Hmm.
Okay? It's a computer, that's how it works.
Mhm.
Okay? The imaginary negative pole is here, and then these are all the positive poles. So these are the eyes of the electrode all looking in toward the center of the heart. Okay?
Okay. Thank you.
So it's unipolar because only one is a real electrode, the other one's created.
Right.
So, okay. Okay. Which leads are positioned from the limb leads to look at the inferior wall of the left ventricle? We've already said that once. So the inferior leads are leads 2, 3, AVF. By next week, this needs to be second nature, okay? Because next week we're doing STEMIs, and you're not going to get much from the, well, you'll get something, but not as much from the lecture if you're not really solid about which leads are corresponding to which area. So next week, I'm going to start next week's class by saying, Andrew, what are the inferior leads?
2, 3.
And you will say 2, 3, AVF. Okay. Okay. So, okay. So here again, here are the limb leads, and 2, 3, AVF, the positive leads are all on the bottom, looking up toward the center of the heart. So they're the inferior leads. Now, which leads, and this is going to be some of the precordials, not just the limb leads, which leads are positioned to look at the septal wall? Anybody know? Which are the septal leads? V1 and V2. By next week, please make this second nature. Septal leads are V1 and V2. Okay? And so if we think about what we're doing here, here's lead 1 and lead 2. They're looking straight in toward the center of the heart, and they're right over the septal wall. So that's why they're able to see it. Another viewpoint is they're looking right in. Then which leads are positioned to look at the anterior of the left ventricle? Say it again, please. V3 and V4. Okay, and again, same caveat. Next week, this should be like, oh, piece of cake. Everybody knows that. Okay. So here's 3 and 4 looking in right toward the front of the left ventricle there. And here's kind of the tricky one. So we're talking about which leads can look at the side of the left ventricle. There are 2 limb leads that are looking at the side of the heart. Anybody know what they are? Say it again.
AVR and AVL.
Not AVR.
One.
Yeah. Leads 1 and AVL. And sometimes these are referred to as the high lateral leads, meaning that they're looking at the upper part of the side of the left ventricle. So we'll talk about, high lateral STEMI, okay? You don't have to use that terminology, but it tends to be kind of useful. And then, so here's the picture. So you can see AVR is over on that side. So AVL and 1 are right here, kind of at the left shoulder, looking toward the heart. So they're really positioned well to look at the high lateral side of the heart. But there are also 2 precordial leads that are really positioned well to look at the side of the heart. Which ones are they? 5 and 6, V5 and V6. Okay? And you would think these would be called the low lateral leads, but for some reason they're not. We just talk about the high lateral leads and then just the lateral leads. So if we put all the lateral leads together, there are 4. Leads 1, AVL, V5, and V6. Okay. So that's the one that's not terribly intuitive until you really think about what's happening. Now notice that AVR, we haven't mentioned AVR. We've gone through all the regions of the heart, and we haven't talked about AVR. And for many years, one of the things that makes 12 leads interesting is it's an evolving science. There are, things are being developed about it all the time. And for quite a lot of years, people said, AVR is just kind of looking up at the top of the right atria, not very useful, we can't use it for anything. That's changing a lot, by the way, and we're going to learn some uses for AVR. However, when we're talking about stemmings, we don't look at AVR. Okay, that's not quite true, but for the moment it's true. Okay, so here are the areas, and again, by next week, this has to be really obvious to you. If you want not such a homegrown version, but a better drawn one. These are the inferior, 2, 3 AVF. These are the septal. Anterior, V3, V4, and then the lateral kind of skips its way through. 1, AVL, V5, and V6. And again, you should be really comfortable with this by next week. So, we're going to start now. And I'm going to cleverly darken that. If you look at the next part of the handout, you'll see what your job is to fill in. You can see what it is. And just do the best you can. It's just your, either you'll know it or you won't. You can cheat and look at the notes. I don't care.
Can we get a break after this?
What's that?
Can we get a little break after this?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Hey, can I just tell you that you're the only instructor that we have that doesn't have problems with the technology in here?
Yeah.
It's very.
Yeah, literally.
Everybody else, it's a shit show every time we come in here.
It's my age.